Off ye golden lights. All right, so we're gonna do codes 2 today. They're gonna start to get more and more sort of like formally fun. Not that centering Garamond isn't a super exciting way to spend your time, but this stuff I think gets infinitely more interesting and starts to resemble more and more actual graphic design. So basically we're talking about like late 1800s like poster and advertisement design today. This is the stuff that, like, you know what this stuff is. It's these stacked, dense fields of typography with a million different typefaces and overly florid language. And what we're gonna look at is why that stuff looks the way it does and how it actually provides like a really critical link between this sort of like invisible traditional typography and then the sort of conceptual typography of the 20th century and modernism. And so the first problem we run into is applying book design to advertising. So this isn't really an advertisement, it's a proclamation. So the form of book design kind of works, even if you were trying to get people to do something. I don't know if you would hand out this dense thing of type right now, but maybe in 1776, when no one was handing you a lot of printed things, you probably read everything and were like, oh, awesome, someone gave me something. But we kind of see they're at this point of, we still have the center type, but it's like trying to figure out how to make it a little bit more dynamic. This kind of single read thing that needs to get attention. It's not the same as a book or a book title page, because like you're handing it to someone and you're trying to get them to do something now. Here's another one from 1795. And one of the things that's interesting is we're like, these are pretty small. So this is 9 3/4 by 5. So maybe it looks like it has some scale, but it's actually not. It's like, what, this big. And what's kind of important here is they're running into the limits of how big their type can be. So one of the problems with metal type, so this is all, you know, cast metal type, is it's actually really soft. Like if anyone has done any letterpress, you'll see like a lot of the type is damaged, and oftentimes like stuff is printed on very soft paper, or it's printed on paper that's actually like been dampened and then let to kind of dry, and all of that's because type is actually fragile. So one of the problems is you can only get type so big before you have like an unstable thing. Like you can't make a big whatever Garamond P that's this big because the metal like isn't strong enough to handle that. Besides the fact that the casting is probably a pain in the ass. So here we go, like election notice for my man Aaron Burr. There's these cool efforts at bringing in more hierarchy. So it's like it's still stuck within this system. And again, it's like that same proportion, like it's basically 11 by 7, but it's like, okay, nomination, William Tabor Esquire, resolved unanimously that Aaron Burr, like they're trying to figure out like, okay, how can we bring out a couple words here to get some more effort? And the tracking stuff is starting to disappear. The like super open, beautiful stuff. Now all of a sudden it's like, we need this line to appear darker. Like we need contrast and we need weight and attention. Here's another one that does like sort of similar thing, but mostly through space. But like, look at, this is pretty cool. So like the hierarchy thing in here is like, it still doesn't occur to anyone to break this into the, like a more traditional headline. It's still like tied to the language of book design, but it's like, okay, willfully, negligently fire, gun loaded, ball or shot, hard, dangerous substance. It's like trying to, it's almost like people when they write an article for the web and they know that people skim, so they bold things throughout so that you're getting information. It's like being applied to an advertisement. And this is tiny, it's 5 by 6. So one of the things that's interesting is some of this stuff looks like it's got massive scale changes, except that it's basically a postcard. So again, it's like pushing the biggest the type can get. And it's like, there's so much stuff in here trying to figure out how to shape meaning through scale and arrangement. Rendezvous with the tumbling sailors, the Royal Navy. On the other hand, the stuff is super interesting looking because of that. But I don't think any of us could probably like willfully design this way, because everything about it, we would just be like, well, why don't we just rewrite it, separate out the information, and make it very clear. We wouldn't take a sentence and then just be doing all this weird stuff. This is kind of a nice moment in history, I think. This one actually like
Oh my God.
really tries to keep the sort of traditional book title page. I mean, it's wild, right? Like, okay, what's interesting to me is if you get past the, oh, it's chaotic and it's crazy and it's centered and like, is this the best way of communicating? And instead you take it as, you can actually see someone's mind at work here. Like, you have all these conventions. Everything is basically you center type. Like, that's how you handle it. So then it's like, okay, what can I do with that to try to communicate and try to cut through the clutter? I believe this would be like a newspaper ad, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like, okay, I'm going to change typefaces. I'm going to make really dramatic scale shifts. And then whoever made this, J. Monk, is still trying to keep some of the that sort of beauty standard of traditional typography. Like the lines go in and out, and it's chaotic, but in a kind of very clear, precise way. They're really trying to do that, but it's like he's like hitting the wall as to like whether this is a good idea anymore. So we have another one, an auction sale. So like this, I think, is an interesting gesture. Basically, I refuse to make the type any smaller, and I'm willing to forego spacing. And it can't get any bigger. Like, this is probably the biggest font in the biggest weight in the font. But on top of that, we see pretty clearly what the margins are. So like, this is a decision of like, all right, this is the way to get it to be biggest. And then you see these funny moves here, like I need to get some impact here. I pretty much only have this one font or one type of font. So I open up the spacing in there, and like, that's a way to get some impact. But of course, that's a weird way to do it because it also recedes into the page. Like, if we're going to sit here and look at this, what are the darkest things on the page? To be sold in oak timber, because they have like sort of normal default spacing. And then when they try to do this stuff, it actually starts to kind of disappear. I love how much stuff is happening in here. Like, Wednesday is small caps, and then April is small caps, which is also kind of cool because they've decided that proper nouns are small caps. Like, that's sort of like interesting, right? Like, and the other thing is, like, these aren't graphic designers, they're printers. Like, they get a job and they immediately go and typeset it in a sort of non-conceptual fashion, but they're like starting to make these conceptual decisions, which I think is really cool. So that was 1815. Yeah, same thing here. It's roughly 9x6. The mail coach notice totally looks like the first page of like the first chapter of a book. Though this is cool. So they're using some version of Bodoni, and all of a sudden, like, now there's some like nice blacks on the page. Okay, so then we get into wood type. So here's the thing that's interesting. This is 15x12. It feels like it's at the same scale as everything else because they have bigger fonts now. So I don't know, I couldn't say for a fact whether the whole page is wood type, but I guarantee that thing that says set on fire and 200-pound reward, those are definitely wood type. And so wood type comes about for kind of a couple of reasons. Like, one, people want to cut through the noise, and they need to make bigger things, and to make bigger things, they're going to need bigger fonts. And you can't make them out of metal, so some enterprising person somewhere realizes they can make them out of wood, like they basically make a woodcut for type. And then all of a sudden, now you can have monstrous type, because that wood is not going to, you're just carving it. It's not going to break, really. I'm sure it warps over time. And it's going to be a little bit more durable than metal type. And you can now respond to this new problem, which is you don't need to make a font that's only readable over hundreds of pages or whatever in a book. You can make a font that only needs to be readable on a poster at a distance. So all of a sudden, like, you take something like Bodoni and then you go nuts with the thicks and thins because it starts to fill up the space more and gets a little bit thicker. And a lot of the things that were necessary for like book typography, now they're disappearing. Because like, now it's like, no, I just need a big compact font that cuts through all that visual clutter. What I think is so exciting about this stuff is that you basically see a totally present day design problem, like how do I cut through the noise? And then strategically making decisions based on that. And so there's this demand for a way to do that, and wood type is the answer. And I can't say whether this stuff is, because it feels like a normal text size, but it's not a normal text size, because this is basically an 11 by 17 sheet. So this has got to be pretty big. So it's either really big metal type or it's really small wood type.
So the little tiny type on here, do you think that was metal?
I feel like this down here has
Could
got to
you
be
actually
metal.
do that with
This
wood?
through here probably is. But the only thing I can 100% say for certain is that this and that, the headlines are definitely wood type.
So is metal type cast?
Yeah. Oh, here we go, 15 by 12. This is like 100% wood type. Check out like the extremes in the thicks and thins here. Like, there's no mistaking like that someone is trying to get your attention right now with this like basically black bar across the page. We're starting to get these bigger pieces, 15 by 12. So now like the problem isn't going to be so much the size of your typeface. It's now going to be the size of your printer that is going to be the thing that's going to stop you from going bigger. This is the most like depressing thing I have encountered in like scanning old stuff.
That's really chilling.
Yeah, it's actually like if you, I can't tell how well you can read this, but it's an inventory with like people's names.
And then they put fine rice. Like,
Yeah, also for
Oh, yeah, yeah.
it's bigger.
Yeah, it's so insane. Thank goodness somebody rescued it because it's clearly beat up. I think it's from England, actually. This one's a smaller one, but these are definitely wood type fonts. Actually, it's not that small. It's 7 by 8, so it's like it's still bigger than a lot of stuff we're looking at. So now, one of the things we're starting to see here now is like the diversity of forms that becomes available once you move towards that wood type. So all of a sudden, it's like you don't need to make all these sizes that need to be readable at 6 points. You're just basically making headline fonts, and all of a sudden, it's like, well, why don't we try this and why don't we try that? And like there starts to be all this like excitement. One of the things that's super cool about this stuff is once you start isolating it, you start seeing fonts that you'd be easily convinced were like invented in the 60s, and it turns out, I mean, this is from 1829, and we have this thing that's like the precursor to like a Lublin graph or something like that. And these great like thick italic Bodonis that look like they're from the 70s because a lot of people in the 70s have been digging into Victorian advertising. There's another one, still kind of on the small side, so this is probably all metal type, but this stuff up here is wood type. And again, like, so I love this. This whole thing is just one giant crazy sentence, and then using this these new fonts, now you can break it out in a way where like there's a hierarchy flow. So it's like doing battle essentially with like, okay, it's got to be centered and it's got to be top to bottom, but we can dig into it, and now we can take one word and make it really big and not have to do what they were doing before, which is like, well, we'll take the one word, make it as big as possible, but then we have to space it out to make it occupy the space. Now it's like, I have this badass font. Boom, fills up the whole line. It's like dark as hell. The other thing to kind of look at as you're looking at this stuff is massive amounts of contrast from line to line. That typically we like look at that and think like, oh, it's chaotic. But the whole point is like, I want you to read this, 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 and this. To do that, it means everything between those has to be completely, totally different than that. So it's like not just scale, it's almost always scale and font are changing line to line. And often, not just the font, but like everything about the font. The kind of proportions of it. This one's really nice. It's actually kind of small, but it's like sort of lovely. 5 by 7. It's like committee room to let. Boom, done. Notice of a political meeting. I don't know that this one was actually read. This was like from an old book where it was like cheaper to print 2 color, and every chunk of the book is in the second color is a different color. So like some stuff, when it's like 2 color, it's like green, and other parts of the book is blue. So like for the longest time, I thought they had this cool red paper, and I think I'm wrong. But I don't know what the original looks like. But basically, you have like sort of classic book typography, but now like the headlines are using that wood type to get kind of nuts. And it's starting to like this kind of stuff, these like graphs, they start to look more like actual charts, not like a book with a bunch of random space in it. Even like this is kind of nice. In favor of the blues, 285. This thing is beautiful, I think. And it really like, so it takes complicated information, like multiple different plays and then like separates each one out to give it like its own identity. And so even though this and this are kind of the same typeface, I feel like the spacing in here, now granted they're justifying it against the outer edge, which is pretty interesting, but it also just feels like this doesn't feel like a weird compromise. Like it feels like cool because of that, like that kind of aggressive space. And then they're going in and like basically dark to extreme lights. And then what's in here? The Pleasures of Acting and the Welsh Ballad of Jenny Jones. Oh, those are songs that Mr. Charles Matthews is going to sing. So like even this is like a nice detail that like you're like, what's going on in there? And you realize like it's still the same idea, like basically a sentence, but again there's like this idea of like, oh, we'll put the songs he's going to sing on a separate line. And I do think like this notion of an outer justified edge is a pretty interesting one, and then that all the sub information is like centered within it. This thing is pretty badass. Washington, D.C., election notice. So this one, what I think is kind of interesting is like when you have like these weird, like every other line is all caps, I think. Oh, no, it's not. There's like some kind of system in here. I can't tell. I can't tell if they just ran out of whatever this almost sans serif font is, or maybe Boak has got something to do with Van Buren. I can't tell, but it's awesome looking. It's super dense. But I do like the repeating of, for president, for vice president, governor, that it's all the same typeface. No, what the hell? No, it's not. For president, for vice president, okay. I'm like, I swear there's a system in here. I haven't looked at this one in a minute. So for president and vice president are the same typeface, and then governor and lieutenant governor are the same typeface. And then whatever this one is, senator and Congress are the same. So there's like this cool little thing of like, oh, this is information that is related to other information, so like let's start to visually group those. And it's funny because it's like, it would be interesting to know, like, I imagine that there's no documentation of this whatsoever, but like, are we actually like looking at the work of like a really smart designer that is actually like working a century ahead of time? Like, that typography should be about organizing things and breaking them up into chunks and then using typefaces as ways of further organizing them? Or is it just like this dude was just kind of eccentric and thought like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if I did this? You'll love this, another theater bill. So this is like 19 inches by 7. And then you just have like every single font or every single play is a different typeface. This one is pretty great too. Again, basically one massive sentence about everything they sell. Love this Boston font. And then on top of that, like so like what's cool is that classical typography is using space to divide information. They're actually using other fonts to divide information. And then when that's not enough, then there's also line breaks. Or not line breaks, there's rule lines. So there's like no white space in these. It's super economical, right? Like I'm paying to have this made. We're fitting as much crap in here as is humanly possible. And it's hard to know whether people at this point in time had not yet learned, do not read everything. Like only read the first line of something to determine if you care. I wonder if it was like, oh, something else to read. This is exciting. I'm sure it'll get good right down in here. Yep. Warning against selling beer. This is such a good picture of like that contrast. Extremely condensed, darks, thicks, and thins versus a more geometric kind of like, or even like traditional proportion with like fat serifs and all fat, what are they called? Whatever. Everything is fat. I can't remember my technical term for the things that connect things in typefaces.
The two L's are cool to see next to each other because they're so different.
Yeah, it's awesome. Oh yeah, that's all. That's fantastic. Yeah, this one actually looks like it's sitting differently. I wonder if this is like from a different version of a similar font. I bet it's got to be. There's no way it's like an alternate. Hit Option E. This one's not quite so dramatic, but this font's pretty great. Oh, that's my last one.
Look at the exclamation points all the way over there on the...
Yeah, it's funny because like, so basically it's the logic must be like justifying this will yield the most impact. even if the spacing is sort of odd. And I like this, I like $500 reward is all caps, and then bank robbery is the same size, but then it goes into title case. So like, again, there's like a hierarchy decision happening there, right? Like, these are related, but they're different. And I think that's really interesting. I think like this kind of work, when you actually take maybe I was gonna say take a step back, but when you take a step into it, you discover that it's a lot smarter than maybe you would have realized. Like, for a long time, I just thought it was interesting and chaotic. And then when I started to see it in line with like what it was coming from and what it turns into, because in a couple weeks we're going to look at like early modernist work, like Dadaism and Futurism and just Steel. And one of the things you realize is that early modernism is basically these wood typefaces plus Mondrian, to like simplify it. That like Mondrian and Kandinsky and Dadaism gives you the freedom to start to use the page organically, and then you use these fonts because they have the most visual impact, and it's like pretty wild. So that'll be kind of interesting.